Isao Takahata's approach to filmmaking is steeped with Japanese nuances and storytelling technique. He interweaves Japanese folklore into every film he directs. I don't think I need to explain this wave painting, but those unfamiliar with Japan will miss this Momotaro reference, or this Princess Kaguya reference, all of which are used in a single comedic sequence. Takahata has never cared about forcing viewers to interpret his art in just one way. In fact, later in his career, he no longer even believed in filling in the blanks of the animation, choosing instead to explore traditional Japanese art's usage of white space. This method of hiding authorial intent is typical in Japan, where books are often intentionally ambiguous for readers to enjoy being active rather than passive, and thus we get interpretations from a global audience.
You know, I've seen a lot of war films, and many of them are exciting or moving or dramatic or artistically effective, and a few of them actually reach you at an emotional level and not just at the action level. I was amazed the first time I saw Grave of the Fireflies to find that I was actually moved just about to tears.
In creative writing, I was taught to, as Kurt Vonnegut put it, pity the reader. Our audience requires us to be sympathetic and patient teachers, ever willing to simplify and clarify, whereas we would rather soar high above the crowd, singing like nightingales. As in, don't make the audience think too much. Give them everything necessary to understand your point as soon as possible. Takahata's storytelling is the opposite. Instead of being straightforward, be indirect. Instead of pitying the reader, respect them in their ability to interpret art.
こうなんですよって観客に押し付けるんじゃなくて、観客の方がむしろ能動的に自分たちの力で想像力を使ってですね、観客の人が。
Takahata doesn't stop himself from soaring like a nightingale. He has achieved critical acclaim without pitying the reader, all while pushing the boundaries of what animation can be. Leaving so much up to the audience's interpretation has its problems though, as Takahata is often surprised by how his works are received, none more so than Grave of the Fireflies.
日本の観客に関してはセーターについて同情的な人が大多数だったんです。でこれはですね、僕としては非常に意外だったんですね。ですからそこら辺をあの映画を見ながらちゃんと判断して、自分たちだったらやっぱりセーターの側になるけれど、しかしセーターの側に行ってれば場合によってはああやって死んでしまったりすることも起こっちゃうんだなっていうふうなふうに見てくれる人がいればよかったんですが、あまりいなかったんです、日本の場合は。そうじゃなくて、ただ同情的に見るっていうふうなことになっていたような気がしますね。
Takahata may have been affected by this. His only film not derived from a previous author is Pompoko, which, although indirect in critiquing how oppressed groups divide themselves to appease their oppressor, an unsurprising addition since Takahata frequently studied the indigenous groups of both Japan and Canada, but is overly direct with its main message on environmentalism. Coming 6 years after Grave of the Fireflies, it could be that he didn't want a repeat of audience misinterpretations. The more likely reason is that he just isn't political in the same way as his co-founder. It was Miyazaki that pushed him to tell the story of Grave of the Fireflies in the first place. Rather than a political statement, Takahata is airing out his own trauma. Vonnegut and Takahata both survived massive bombing raids by the Allied forces, and both created masterpieces about their experience. Although Takahata didn't write the novel Grave of the Fireflies, all the firebombing scenes are based off of his own experiences during the war.
実際にガラガラ降ってきて、それでボンボン燃えて、その中を水をかぶったりしながらですね、非常に生々しく体験した人間としてですね、自分の人生の中で一番大変だった体験ではなかろうかと思います。
But unlike Vonnegut, who unabashedly blames the US for the bombings, Takahata never has the US forces leave the background setting of the film. They're just there, happening. They interrupt the story, but they aren't its antagonists.
I think maybe this movie is saying that firebombing is not a very precise way of going after the enemy. It's a way to destroy morale. It's a way to break down a nation's will to resist. But at the same time, are we really thinking about people like this little brother and his even smaller sister when we drop those bombs? Or are we managing to objectify the Japanese as an evil race who deserve to have this happen to them?
I love this clip of Ebert because it highlights the beauty of Japanese storytelling. Ebert's interpretation is to reflect upon our country's targeting of ordinary citizens in Japan. But I can't help but feel like he is focusing on our country more than the film is.
お国のために働いてる人らの弁当と一日中ブラブラしとるあんたらとなんで同じ思うの？あんたらはお米ちっとも出さんとそれでご飯食べた言うてもそらいけませんよ。通りません。お母ちゃん。セータさん、小井さんも兄さんもお国のために働いてるんですさかい。せめてあんた泣かせんようにしたらどないやの？毎晩警報で加減みんな寝不足になっとる言うのにうるそうて寝られへん。
Studio Ghibli is known for their attention to detail, and although Hayao Miyazaki is the most respected in this regard, Takahata is who taught him how to do it.
音が柔らかかった。牛がない時できた。いや違う。あ、そうなの？これの方が安いです。竹針の方が高いですよ。いいよこれ絶対。パクさんしか知らないんだから。
The film isn't exaggerating the pervasiveness of military worship during the 40s. In fact, Takahata gives us a close-up of the magazine Shifu no Tomo, the housewife's friend, a real conservative publication that promoted the benefits of having women stay at home. In Hayakawa Tadanori's book, Shinkoku Nihon no Tondemo Kessen Seikatsu, specific volumes are shown along with their instructions for how Japanese women should defend Japan with their lives. Here's a selection of titles and covers leading towards the end of the war. Once again, Takahata shows us why the aunt is the way she is, instead of telling us. I have to question if a wartime apologist would put this much detail into depicting the reality of life under the Imperial Empire. I can say that Takahata is conservative, since the work he adapted into feature films are either rooted in an idyllic rural lifestyle, the nuclear family, or Japanese traditional folklore and imagery. Conservative in his own way, as he extends appreciation of tradition to include indigenous and threatened ways of life. Takahata based Seita off the modern youth of Japan. It was a typical case of the older generation going after the youth. He had no idea that audiences would be sympathetic rather than yell at his stupid decisions.
ですからある意味ではそのセータに対するセータという人物に対する批判が出たとしてもそれは当然だと思うし、それは出てくれるぐらいの方が良かったと思うんですね。取るべき態度ではなかったんじゃないか、あの時に映画の中から見ることができるっていうのは大事なことなんじゃないかなというふうに私としては思ってますから。
When large audiences have similar reactions to a film, it's indicative of a shared cultural connection between them all. But if it wasn't intended by the director, it's usually an indication of a generational difference the director wasn't aware of. Americans had been increasingly more open to questioning our past, which explains Ebert's review. Vonnegut and other authors opened up an entire discussion questioning the US's war narratives.
Here was a lie we had been told. Our enemies bombed civilian populations, whereas our side did not. We saw for ourselves it simply wasn't true.
Are we the baddies?
Takahata and Miyazaki come from the generation raised within the ruins of war. They were too young to fight, but old enough to remember the social atmosphere and the hellscape. When it comes to analyzing Japanese art about the war, the most important detail is who does the author appear to blame for the devastation. With Takahata's generation, it was the Japanese government's refusal to surrender and prolonging the devastation.
自分の親父やおふくろたちが生きてる時に感じてたような不安を今自分たちが感じてるんだと思います。戦争のアメリカと戦争やるとは夢にも思わなかった。 中国との戦争に泥沼に入ってくっていうのがね。で結局発狂するように世界中相手に戦争するみたいなことになっちゃう。
Are we the baddies?
The younger generations have been raised under governments that have manipulated educational material to remove any mentions of Japan's victims, and instead frame the war as wholly US versus Japan, which helps the Japan as victim narrative. Looking at it this way, Grave of the Fireflies accidentally fits within that mold and reinforces the propaganda. This revisionist viewpoint of history was also helped by the US's own reevaluation of its past bombing campaigns because of the horrors of the Vietnam War. When the novel was written in the late 60s, Japan was finally dealing with its inferiority complex with the US, who occupied them after the war. It was written alongside the book American Hijiki by the same author, both novels discussing how Japan had changed post-war, with American Hijiki being focused on the present day in the 60s, but Fireflies juxtaposing the 60s with the war era the same way Takahata tried to compare kids from the 80s with the war era. The book's author, Nosaka, began writing because the youth being raised in an affluent Japan were starting to forget the war, which allowed the victimhood narrative to begin taking root. His books were made to ensure that stories about the war would be written by those that survived it. Collective guilt, community participation, and even the US's actual misdeeds were all swept away by economic prosperity. Eventually, wartime amnesia would give way to revisionist history. He hoped his voice, which he dubbed the Scorched Earth Generation, would cut through it. This is personal conjecture here, since Takahata has invited us all to interpret as we wish, but I don't think Takahata misunderstood the intentions of the novels. I can only envision this as an attempt of two fellow Scorched Earth children wishing to immortalize the voice of a fellow survivor, especially the ending scene. What else is it to be inferred here other than, you have forgotten us, yet you live on our grave? We're lucky to be able to enjoy the works of art created by those that came before us. We're even luckier that they create places for us to escape to and learn from in our own way. Takahata has expanded what's possible in animation by bending the medium to accommodate Japanese expression. Takahata was always more interested in sharing Japanese culture than his own opinions, and although I prefer the other master of Studio Ghibli, I am grateful for his teachings. There are just as many ways to interpret art as there is to create it. Authorial intent is just one avenue to understand art's impact on society. But more importantly is the cultural, generational, and political landscape of those who consume the art, and authors typically can't predict what people will do with their work.
可能性の幅を広げたいんで、あんまりこう全部を押し付けるようにね。どっちみちその想像でやってもらわなくちゃいけないところが多いわけですからね。
Farewell, Takahata sensei. I'd like to thank this commenter here for asking me to look into this, or just kind of asking, and then I went and looked into it on my own. As always, I'm still experimenting with what type of content to make. I currently believe that the video portion of the video essay is more important than the essay, so I cut a lot out. If you want more of that, please let me know. Or if you don't mind some more just text on screen or talking heads, that would let me fit in a lot more references too. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you when I finally finish another idea.